there are a lot of adverts around. Things really ramp up towards the end of the year. There's like a competition for all of our eyeballs for the things we see. The last estimate I read about adverts and advertising is that we're exposed, each of us, to over 6,000 adverts a day. That's on our phones, on our computers, on our TVs, while we're driving our cars, while we're reading a newspaper, while we're walking along the street, while we're listening to the radio. And the aim behind all these brands, all these adverts, apart from trying to make us think that we need things that we don't actually need, is to reinforce sometimes the decisions of what we've already made by buying into that particular brand so that we have some sort of loyalty. It gets us to associate certain images, certain names, certain brands with certain qualities so that we assume just because we see the brand that there's going to be some sort of expectation of high quality or reliability or whatever it is behind it. That we're getting what we expect. In the ancient Near East, where the stories of Jesus of Nazareth are set, in the time of the Roman Empire that was stretching across most of the known world at the time, there was no mass communication, there was no mass advertising in the way that we have now. Well, that's not exactly true. Not in the way we would understand it, but communication was still important, and the Roman machine had to be kept going. And so there were various different groups all over the place that needed to be entertained, they needed to be controlled, they needed to be managed so that the money would keep rolling in and keep feeding the machine. And so they used parades, flags, circuses, games, events that would draw people in and get them to see what the Roman Empire and the Greek and Roman culture was all about. But the most widespread way of branding, if you like, of getting images and messages across the whole of this really spread out in different empire, was something that was in people's hands, in people's pockets. It was currency, coins. Coins were needed and used every day for the business, for buying and selling, for exchanging goods and services. And so the Roman Empire would use these coins and the images on the coins to reinforce their brands. Images of the emperors and the kind of things that they did, their victories and what they had achieved, reminding people that the Roman Empire was the one that entertained them, that fed them, that clothed them, that kept them happy in some sort of way. In these different occupied countries, local rulers could also mint their own coins. And the local king in Israel, in what we now call Palestine, was a puppet king known as Herod. And he was Jewish, kind of, but he was actually kept there by the Roman Empire. And he was allowed to make his own coins. And of course, a Jewish leader couldn't make coins with an image on it. That was forbidden. So instead, the image of a person, instead he chose images that were familiar to the territory. Here's an example of one that had reeds on it. And this became an image associated with him, this image of reeds. Into this empire machine, into this particular puppet kingdom, two men start making a huge fuss. One is called John, and he gets a reputation for being different from everybody else, for challenging them to turn around their lives and to remind them what their God is all about, and for immersing people in a river as a sign of that. The other is a man called Jesus of Nazareth. They're actually related. John came slightly before Jesus, and the crowds that came to see him heard again their own story and were reminded that if they had just remembered who they were, they would live a different way. They wouldn't be sucked into the Roman Empire. John kept telling them that their God was acting and he was actually going to clear out all the rubbish. For them, that was obvious. That was getting rid of the Romans. And if they didn't want to be part of that being cleared out, then they had to turn around. And as a sign of that, they were baptized. They were immersed in the river. John then seemed to have a powerful realization that Jesus of Nazareth was at the center of what God was doing. And so John started to point people to Jesus. that Jesus was actually someone they had been waiting for, someone who was going to be a big part of how God would put things to rights. It seemed that what John hoped for, like most normal, ordinary Jewish people of the time, who weren't tied up in making profits from the Roman machine, was that God was going to sort things out. God was going to get rid of the rubbish, the Romans. Being such a pain, being so vocal, meant that John rubbed up against the king and against the Roman authorities, and he ends up in prison. At that point, it seems that he maybe had some doubts, and he begins to question if Jesus is exactly who he was hoping for. You see, so far, Jesus has been causing a fuss. He's been stirring things up. He's been teaching. He's been demonstrating how he feels God's way is, and that way is about, well, so far in the story that we call Luke, it's been about love, loving enemies. It's about doing good. It's about praying for everyone. It's about blessing, healing, feeding, including restoring, comforting. His reputation is one of grace and compassion. He's helped outsiders even, known as Gentiles. He's helped soldiers of the Roman Empire. He's helped women. He's helped outsiders, outcasts. I wonder if John is thinking this is not quite what he was hoping for. So he sends a couple of his own followers, his own students, to speak to Jesus and to say, look, are you the one I've been pointing everyone towards? Now, the Jewish people were waiting for one who was to come, waiting for they thought, a new king, some sort of prophet, a messenger from God who was going to be part of turning things around, and they assumed getting rid of the rubbish. Jesus' first response, certainly as described by Luke, is interesting. It's not about words. It's about actions. Instead, we get a description of the kind of things that Jesus is doing. I watch a lot of football, and there's a phrase that's used time and time by football managers, football commentators, football players, and that is when everything is a bit dark or difficult, or people are asking something controversial, they tend to trot out the phrase, well, they do their talking on the pitch. Jesus is doing his talking on the pitch. Here's my reply, he says. Well, he doesn't say anything. But instead, there's a description of diseases being cured, sicknesses being cured, evil spirits being dealt with, the blind being able to see. And then Jesus speaks and he describes again what has already been happening, the actions, in a very careful way. And what he does is he quotes it in a way that his Jewish listeners would understand, from one of their most famous prophets known as Isaiah, who talked about the one who was to come. And Jesus is aligning what he's doing along with these words from Isaiah in chapter 35 and in chapter 61 in particular. These are messages of hope from prophets who said this is what God is doing and will do. Seems to me that what Jesus is saying here is that God is at work, John, and sorry, it's not necessarily what you were imagining, but it is exactly what God needs to do and in fact has always been doing. Time and time again in these stories, all the way through the scriptures and through the experience of God and his people, are that their own expectations are too small, too limited, or go along the wrong tracks, and instead they're burst or expanded as God actually works. It's not that God's actually doing something strange or different, it's that their own ideas, our ideas, are so often too small. Jesus then speaks about John. He says some, to us, strange things, because he talks about reeds in the wind, and then he talks about palaces and fine clothes. Until we remember that the coins in people's pockets, the coins of Herod, have the reeds on them. And of course, Herod is famous for his palaces and his clothes. When he talks about what people are expecting and looking for, maybe in John or in other places, he's talking about their expectations that they're looking for a new king. A king along the same kind of lines. And this is not what God is interested in at all. The other expectation they have, and he mentions this, is a prophet. They want a prophet who's going to tell them that God is going to take out the rubbish. But instead he talks about John as a prophet along the lines of someone called Malachi. And Malachi in chapter 3 says God was going to prepare the way. Someone was going to be a messenger that would point to what God was going to be doing. And Jesus says John is doing that. And then Jesus says what might be even more confusing to us when he talks about funerals and pipes and kids. Most folk would think, having examined this, that in actual fact he's referring to something that would have been a children's game of the day, called weddings and funerals. And when you played one kind of music, people would act as if they were at a wedding, and another kind of music, people would act as if they were at a funeral. It was a game. I wonder if Jesus is saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to play according to your tune. I'm not going to fit into your expectations. And just because things are happening in ways that you didn't expect or you didn't want, that doesn't mean it's not God at work. It's a classic phrase. You can never please all the people all of the time. John was famous for the things he didn't do. He didn't drink. He didn't live in the city. He wore different clothes, and he lived a very simple and sparse life. They criticized him for that. Jesus was among the people, eating and drinking with all sorts, and he gets himself a reputation for eating and drinking too much with the wrong kinds of people, and they criticize him just as much as they criticize John. They were each of them in their way not what people thought they wanted or needed or expected. But Jesus then finishes with a tiny little phrase where he says that wisdom is proved right in the end by those who understand. Now, wisdom is a phrase that's used all the way through the Jewish scriptures as an image of God and God at work. God's presence. Jesus is saying here, I believe, that what you will see in my life and death and resurrection and the movement that we are all being drawn into is that God's plan, God's work has always been bigger, much, much bigger than our expectations. And that wisdom will be proved right as people understand. Understand what? Well, they understand, he says, as God's children. They understand that they are all God's children, and that's their identity, and that their God will never fit into the boxes and the brands and the images that others and other empires would like them to fit into. And that in actual fact, that is good news.